Hello, everyone. We've got a big group of people here, so thanks for joining for Marmon's step one of the quad and quartile training. I really appreciate everybody's attendance here, and thanks to all the businesses that are on the front lines of fighting this virus. A few things before we start. First off, I have a few panelists that will try to answer questions during the presentation. Given the number of people that are registered, if the panelists can't get to your questions, I'll be answering them at the end of the session. If you have a question, please use the Q&A tab. If you have a technical issue like low volume, you can't hear me, or don't know how to use a feature, use the chat feature and we'll try to get your question resolved. If there are any geeks in the crowd like me that know the answers to this, chat is open to everyone, so please feel free to try to do that. When this training is complete, I'm going to email the presentation that I'm giving, as well as a link to the recording. I'll be doing this same session 6 more times in the coming days and weeks at 6 a.m., 12 p.m., and 9 p.m. in the Central Zone time slots to make sure that we can get to our businesses in Europe, in China, and everywhere else. To start off, I'd like to open up a poll to everyone to better help me understand what the different types of businesses are that we have represented on this call. So if you could take just a couple seconds and answer that, I'd appreciate it. I'm doing this poll because we've historically focused toolbox training on high volume, repeatable manufacturing businesses. But in the last 2 years, we've been able to apply it across a broad different types of companies, service-based companies like Sterling Crane, distribution companies like Marmon, Keystone, and even in our rail leasing groups. All right, I'm going to give about 10 more seconds on the survey here. All right, and let me see if I can figure out how to share these results. So interesting, you know, we see, I think, what we typically see with Marmon businesses. There are a lot of high volume, repeatable manufacturing businesses, but we also have some service and leasing businesses, some repair businesses, and different types of manufacturing businesses. So thanks for your sharing that. This training is going to be focused on the first tool within the Marmon toolbox, quads and quartiles. It's my hope that by the end of this training, I can demonstrate just how powerful this tool is. My team has also developed some automation that greatly simplifies the quad creation tool, which I'll be able to show you throughout this presentation. Quads and quartiles are a valuable tool that helps us understand how our businesses are changing. Especially today, given all the uncertainty and changes in the past few days and weeks, I think that this tool is especially relevant. As we all begin to recover from this global pandemic, I sincerely believe that this kind of granular data analysis in this training will ensure that we're making the right kinds of decisions. A quick bit about my background. I was with ITW for 11 years before making my own consulting company for a few years, and eventually coming over to Marmon in 2015. Since then, I've had the chance to lead a few of our big turnaround businesses. Perhaps the most significant was taking the business from negative 8% OI to 3% OI in just under a year. The tools in this presentation really lay the foundation for how that work was done. In all my time with ITW and my own company, and especially with Marmon, I've been exposed to a lot of different business types. Like we saw earlier, high volume manufacturing, job shop, service, healthcare, distribution. I even consulted for a business here in Chicago that turned a 20-story building into a self-sustaining hydroponic grow farm for tilapia and tomatoes. And like I said before, the toolbox is really the key factor in turning these businesses around. In the last 2 years, I've been in this continuous improvement role. And one of my first tasks was to visit many of our business units around the world and develop a formal assessment to see exactly where they were on the toolbox journeys. One of the most common issues that I found was a lack of consistent training, especially in quads and quartiles. Now, quads and quartiles, like I said, I consider this to be the foundational tool of the toolbox. If a business isn't equipped to consistently go back to their data, it's just not possible to progress through the rest of the toolbox. So to help close that gap, we plan on doing more webinars like this in the future. This is just step one of quads and quartiles that will grow into 3 or 4 levels of progressive trainings. So hopefully you can take this, you can run with it, you can glean some great stuff from it. Join us for the second session, join us for the third session. What is the toolbox? Well, first, it's founded in patience and consistency. Some of the businesses that have used it best understand that it cannot be a flavor of the month. They found new ways to apply it as they've seen it really take hold. WebWheel, especially in the transportation sector, for example, was able to implement a self-directed workforce several years back as a result of their hard work. It's what I call an all-inclusive thinking process. We can't give you a book that says, here, do this in this order. It's not like Google Maps with turn-by-turn directions. I can give you the tools and I can give you the trainings to help guide you to analyze and think through your data. The toolbox helps understand where complexity lies and how to simplify it. At its core, it's always about going back to the data, understanding the data, and scientifically iterating through the problem-solving process. It's ultimately about focusing on key products, key customers, and key services of the business. I'll say some businesses that have misapplied this over the years have really hyper-focused on the non-key customers and low-volume products. What we have to remember is at the end of the day, it's always about focusing and servicing key customers and high-volume products. Finally, it's designed to help you grow your business and your talent. The talent, is really key to making this work. And again, these trainings represent an investment in you. The toolbox can be counterintuitive at times. We've all grown up with the traditional phrase, the customer is always right. One of the nuggets of wisdom that I've seen from businesses that apply this well is that some customers are more right than others. And it's not all about overhead reduction, it's about growth. Especially all that's going on right now, I think that that's a powerful message and one that we've been teaching consistently over the last 2 years. As we dig out of this mess right now, our collective focus should be on growing businesses. It says that all customers, products, and services are not created equal. I bet that if you go to customer service and ask if there are 1 or 2 customers that are just plain difficult to work with, they could give you names within a tenth of a second. I'll get into this later, but we don't necessarily want to walk away from those customers. What we want to do is reduce their impact on the business through simplification. It augments and supports the lean toolbox. I've personally been a lean black belt since 2006, and I consider myself a practitioner of lean principles for more than 20 years. For many years, 80-20 and lean were seen as kind of 2 opposing views, and it's just not the case. There are tools within the lean toolbox that can be extremely valuable when we look at it through the lens of the toolbox. For example, you can visit some companies that have taken lean concepts like 5S to a purest degree and have every pen and marker location outlined on their desk. That's just not something that we would do given our 80-20 perspective at Marmon. That said, though, applying 5S in a factory environment is incredibly valuable in helping us identify and reduce waste. This toolbox drives the entire business model and strategy, not just the shop floor. I know this goes back to basics, but it's based on the Pareto principle. In the simplest of terms, you can say in any homogeneous universe, 20% of your pots and pans cook 80% of your food, 20% of the clothes in your closet are worn 80% of the time. To put it another way, I know this is a common thing we say at Marmon, but we focus on the 80 because to equal a 10% improvement on $80, you need to make a 40% improvement on $20. And quite frankly, it's just easier to make a 10% improvement than a 40% improvement. Like all things, the toolbox is constantly evolving. The next step that is really guiding our thinking on application of the toolbox is something we call the Marmon Business System. This is something that Michelle Michalik and her team and I are working through and should be able to roll this out soon. But it's really based on these 5 elements. In terms of smart segmentation, we're organizing, accelerating growth business segments, continuing with that decentralized attitude, dedicated company resources. For sustain and fixed businesses, we're just looking at critically at how we've segmented those in the past and how do you maximize overall value, especially if you have a declining market segment. Niche market focus is all about identifying niche markets where we have the right to win. Innovation and differentiation is focused on dedicating innovation resources. We have an entire new innovation group. to build out product pipelines, give us a more sustainable competitive advantage. Operational excellence, that's really my baby, that's my focus. It's all about using this mentality of waste elimination and continuous improvement to give us the most competitive cost position. And the most important, talent is about effectively building, deploying, and enabling our people. So let's get into the meat of it. This is the way that we approach data, called a quad. What we do is we start with transactions, typically 12 months rolling, but it could vary depending on the cyclicality of a business. And then we build a pivot table in Excel. And we build that pivot table, whereas the x-axis represents the customer. So you can see customers lined up across the top here. Customer A is a $33.5 million. Customer B is a 19.3, and so on down the line. You have the y-axis, which is your products. So we have product one, product two, total sales on product one is 27 million, right? And so on and so forth. And then we have units. We have a third variable. And in this case, the units are revenue. So we take this and we take our customers and we sort them from greatest revenue to least revenue. And we do the same thing with products. And we get this pivot table that tells us, as an example, customer D buys $5 million worth of product one every year, according to the export that we did. Customer F buys $400,000, of product seven, and so on and so forth. What we do then is we look at the cumulative totals. So if I go to customers, and you can see right here along the bottom, I have a cumulative total percentage. Customer one alone represents 34% of the business. Customer A and B together represent 53. 71% is the first three. 80% is the first four customers. Once we reach that 80%, we draw a line to the right. We say we separate our key customers from our non-key customers. We do the same thing from the product standpoint. We take our cumulative percentages. So across the top here, product number one, 27% of the business is in product one, 48% of the business is in one and two combined, and so on. When we hit 80%, we draw a line below that product number four. When we combine those, we get what's called a quad. And this trend, again, holds true whether I've seen this in distribution businesses, service businesses, healthcare, high volume manufacturing, low volume manufacturing, job shop. What we typically see is that 65% of the revenue comes in quad one, 15% in quad two, 15% in quad three, 15% in quad four. So to recap, in quad one, we have key customers buying high volume product. In quad two, we have key customers buying low volume product. Quad three is non-key customers buying high volume products. And quad four is non-key customers buying low volume product. Now, here's where we start to think through this stuff. When we think through it, when we look at this from a perspective of focus, and what I mean by focus is, where are our people spending their time and energy? Let's just start with the assumption we've got kind of a focus matrix here. And let's start with the assumption that people's day-to-day activities are divided equally among each type. It's maybe not a great assumption, but let's start there. What we actually see if we go to the inside salesperson or the customer service rep or accounts receivable is that typically most of their time and energy and focus is spent servicing non-key customers. Big customers typically place orders on EDI. They typically have wire remittance for invoicing and payment. They typically pay on time. It's the Jimmy Bob's window emporiums of the world that are placing the onesie-twosie orders over the phone. They're asking for price sheets, that are asking for pallets to be stacked in a special way. They're the ones that are doing comparison quotes just for a reference that you'll probably never get the business. Your people are spending a disproportionate amount of time and energy and focus on these customers. They're low volume, they place tiny orders, they place frequent orders, and they often have a lot of questions. We see the same thing on the shop from a product perspective. We typically have high volume inlines set up for our key products. It's the low volume ones that cause us to break in for a changeover, run 2 or 3 parts, and then do another changeover. And often they're rush orders for non-key customers. So back to our graph, we ask ourselves, where is our time spent? And this is what we typically see is very little time. It's the inverse. Very little time is spent servicing key customers on high volume products. And most of the overhead in the business is dedicated to that quad four. The toolbox gets us back and asks the question, where should our time be spent? And of course, I always contend quad one is where that time should be spent. It's not just the examples I mentioned earlier too. You look at something like scheduling. The more lines that you have dedicated to only high volume product, the less time you need for, the less you have a need for a scheduling resource. My last business was simplified to the point where the operators could make the decision on what to run and when to run using simple visual triggers. We just didn't need a scheduling department. Fontaine Trailer in the transportation group is another great example of this kind of complexity reduction. I'm vastly oversimplifying their story. If you ever have a chance to hear it, it's fantastic. But essentially, they make flatbed over-the-road trailers that are pulled by large semis. Prior to the toolbox, every trailer was unique. It was like a fingerprint. It took weeks to design a trailer, custom tailored to whatever the customer wanted. Once designed, they had to go out and source all these unique components. On the floor, there was no such thing as an inline. It could take 20 hours to make a trailer. It could take 200. You think about that from a cost perspective. Their costs just weren't well understood. And then think about servicing a trailer years after the sale, looking through the bills of materials, trying to decipher what and when and why decisions were made. In Fontaine's case, they took a big leap and they went from an infinite number of SKUs, an infinite number of fingerprints, to 3 base models. Now, the top line ended up taking a big hit, but over years, the bottom line skyrocketed. Whereas before it would take weeks to get a trailer to, we were talking with them earlier in the year, and today on one shift, they can make 43 trailers in the same facility footprint. They really revolutionized that industry and they left the competition in the dust. Again, it's lack of focus in the right areas that we want to address with this. You may have seen this P&L example before. We have $1 million business here that we split into a high volume segment, the 80, and a low volume segment, the 20. Traditional thinking says that we then can take all the materials, the processing and overheads, and make that same split along the 80-20 rule. In the end, excuse me, we have 2 segments, each making roughly 20% ROS. The reality, though, is that overheads can't be split like that for all the reasons I just talked about. In fact, what we often see is the inverse of 80-20 in overhead, where 80% of the overhead often goes to servicing low volume. Here's where you can see both of those graphs overlaid, and you can see the vast difference there. How profitable are these segments really, the 80 from the 20? When I come into a business, I told you about the assessments that we were doing earlier. It's often very easy to see the symptoms of complexity. These are the top 5 aspects that I often see in companies that either haven't started their toolbox journey or are just beginning. You see poor delivery and inventory performance, special products interfering with standard products, salespeople don't know what to sell, customers don't know what to buy, and purchasing doesn't know what, when, and where to buy stuff. If you want to assess a business very quickly, though, I do 2 things. I look at their on-time delivery metrics, and then I spend an hour with purchasing. As a general rule of thumb, everything rolls downhill to purchasing, and the more complexity the business has, often the less hair the purchasing people have, and I should know that. Complexity really rears its ugly head in purchasing. Quartiles, another very powerful tool. We call it the kick in the pants analysis because it really puts perspective to the complexity in a business. A quartile is simply a quarter of the total customer or SKU count. So if you have 100 customers, you have 25 customers in each quartile. If you have 20 customers, you have 5 in each quartile. What we see when we look at the quartiles is that in general, businesses realize less than 3% of their sales from the bottom 2 quartiles combined. So what that says is if I have 1,000 customers, 500 of those customers generally are creating less than 3% of the revenue. In the 50 or so businesses that I've had a chance to work with in quads and quartiles over the last year and a half, the actual Marmon numbers are 2.9% from a customer quartile perspective and 2.7% from a product quartile perspective. In general, in the bottom quartiles, contribution margins are low, and these typically account for a majority of the complexity. Here's a good way just to look at quads and quartiles visually a different way. You can see I put the quads up here in solid lines at the 80-20 delineation, and then the quartiles are part of the dotted lines. Again, just looking at this visually, this portion of the business typically accounts for less than 3% of the revenue. The same thing from the product standpoint, typically less than, I'm sorry, from a customer standpoint, typically less than 3% of the revenue. When you get to this area, the bottom, this is typically far less than 1% of the revenue. There's a saying that I really like in this is that it's really, really hard to mess this up. This is the area where I really encourage businesses to test. Can you double the price? Can you increase the lead time? Can you only ship full pallets? Can you segment it into profitability? It's really hard to mess that up. Even if you do, the ramifications often aren't severe enough to the top line to warrant any kind of concern. Before we get into your data, again, I want to emphasize this is a thinking process. This list, and again, I'll make all these presentations available for download, but this list is a list of thinking points that I encourage to print out as you go through your first quad analysis. There are some really powerful examples in here. I like what Jared Argyle says on he's the sector president of electrical products sector. And he says, for these guys, we will pick their kids up from school. This is the real reason for 80-20. It's the real reason for the toolbox. We want to nurture and grow this. We want to micromanage them. We want to make everything on inlines. And we especially want to look critically at incentives, and specifically Salesforce incentives. That's often one of the first things that we'll evaluate as leaders and weigh them much more strongly into the green. Quad 2, these are still good customers. We say handle them with care. I brought up an example from Webwheel earlier. I want to bring up another one without getting too many specifics, but they had a key customer that was buying product here. And it was a relatively simple conversation to talk to them and say, hey, listen, I've got a product up in Q1 that I can sell you for X that still meets these requirements. It's a conversation that as a business, we tend to not often have enough. Again, I go back to, is there a way that you can incentivize a sales force to have those kinds of conversations? Quad 3, minor customers, still important products. The key point here is you may have some potential key customers in this category. As we go through the granular quad analysis in a couple minutes here, that's one of the things that I really encourage you to think about and be critical about is where are the potential key customers right there, or I call them sometimes conditional key customers. And then quad 4, again, this is your area for experimentation. Zero up will be covered in quad and quartile training number 2, which we'll do in a little bit here. But go through zero up exercises, I say quickly iterate. You have to handle these differently. Can you outsource it? Again, you can see all the different thinking points that are around there. Again, red rules are another topic that we'll talk about in the second module of training, where we can talk through some examples of that. Now, after looking at quad 4, I want to make an especially important point. Especially in that area, it's easy to start saying no. No, this word devastated many businesses. I reminded of an example in the metal sector where there was a letter written to a customer where it says, we're 80-20ing you up. We're no longer going to do business with you. No, 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 no. That letter has prevented us from coming into that customer, which actually became a pretty major player for a long time. Now, fortunately, there's a lot of headway into there, as I understand. But that idea of no and that mindset of no really hurt us. The key that I want you to come out of this with is yes, but. One of my colleagues would tell a great story of his experience with an environmental test lab. They were running soil samples for $50 each from mom and pop contractors that all showed up in quad 4. Their green business was working with large contractors on bulk sampling. What they ended up doing was creating a segment to handle only the 1s and 2s with 2 dedicated people. They raised the price from $50 each to $350 each, and right away they lost half their customers. They said, we don't want to pay for it. But of the ones that did stay, they were making 7 times the revenue per order. And equally as importantly, they truly understood their cost. There was no allocations going on. They had 2 dedicated people to this business. And it became a really profitable part of the business. It's that yes, but attitude that helped them through that thinking process. Before the automation tool that we're about to see, we would do what's called the old school analysis. We would take and plot out on a 6-point font. In this case, well, actually the biggest one that we've seen was 30 foot by 45 feet, and 98% of their revenue fit within an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of paper. This was a very cumbersome process. I still like it because it's a great visual that says, wow, we make a lot of stuff. Excuse me. But again, this drives the need for why we created this automation tool that I'm about to show you. All right, to start with the automation tool, step 1. Actually, let me take a step back. What I found in businesses when I talked earlier about the inconsistent training and the inconsistent application, what I found is that it was typically easy for businesses to generate an export out of their ERP system of transactions. The difficult part was actually getting it into a pivot table or getting it into some format where it was where you could easily do an analysis on it. This tool that I'm about to present is the tool that should help close that gap. So we're going to get into kind of the meat of how to put data together and how to use this tool. So first step is we create a 4-column Excel spreadsheet. And we say 1 row is 1 transaction. And we look at, I typically recommend rolling 12 months. Depending on the cyclicality of the business, it could be 2 years, it could be 6 months. It just depends on what your business is. But again, we organize it such that 1 row is 1 transaction. In column A, we put the x-axis of the quad. In this case, it's going to be customers. In column B, we put the y-axis. In this case, it's going to be products. In column C, we put the initial units. In this case, we're going to look at revenue to start. And in column D, and this is what I would argue is probably the most important of this, is segment. And what I mean by segment is for anything that is non-homogeneous within your data set. Transco Manufacturing in Newton Falls, Ohio. They make a couple different product lines. They make something called a coil car cover, which is a 50 foot by 20 foot. If someone's on from Transco, I might be wrong with those dimensions. Bottom line is they're huge, big metal parts. They also make a lot of parts that are this big. And in their universe, those 2 data sets are non-homogeneous. Those are 2 distinct segments. So in column 4, what I would do is I would have a coil car cover and I would have an everything else. Depending on how many different values you have in segment, what it will do is generate a unique quad for each segment. So if I have 4 different values in segment, if I have coil car covers, product line A, product line B, product line C, it'll generate 5 quads. It'll generate an overall quad, and then it'll generate 4 unique quads by segment. Special note before you use this, remove the filters, remove special characters, formulas, and any kind of extra columns from the source data. For those that generate this stuff, what I'll do is I often say paste values. And then we get to our automation tool. Now, I want to tell everybody to stop right now. Before you go to quad.marmon.com, I have tested this with 12 concurrent businesses. We have how many people that are on here? I can't even see. So yeah, we have 169 participants in here. If everybody goes to quad.marmon.com and runs a data set right now, it's going to crash. We're working on upgrading that right now. We're working on the scalability of that. What I ask is that you not go through this immediately, that you save it for a bit next week. If you see that it is timing out, there's probably too many people on it. Again, it's something that's my top priority, is making sure that we can scale this up. So let me show you here. Here's the Excel spreadsheet that we've created. Let me make sure that my screen is sharing properly here. So here's the example spreadsheet that we've created. And in this case, we've got exactly what I showed earlier. We've got the customer in column A, we've got the part number in column B, we've got revenue in column C, and we've got our segment in column D. What I do is I save this out. I go to quad.marmon.com. It'll pull up this screen right here. I browse for this file. In this case, it's webinar example number 2, and I hit run automation. Now it'll take about 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, it'll pop up with a file. And I'm not going to be patient here. I'm just going to pull up the file that it pulls up. And it'll pull up a file like this. And what we see right here is we have our overall quad, and we have one quad for each one of those unique segments. Again, in this case, we have Midwest and we have Southeast. It also creates a pivot table. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty about a customer or about a transaction, you have the ability to do that. So let's look at this quad. Let's look at the Midwest quad right here. First thing that I like to look at is what are my breakdowns in percentages. Again, I shared earlier, we typically see 65%, 15%, 15%, 5%. This data set is not too far off from that. Then I like to go to what I call the kick in the pants analysis, the quartiles. In this case, we have 152 customers, 20 of which we consider key customers. If I go to my quartiles though, I have 1.8% in quartile 3, I have 0.4% in quartile 4. I add those together, I get 2.2%. So what we're saying is that I've got 152 customers. 76 of those customers are generating 2.2% of my sales. That's a great place to start when we go back to that thinking point sheet that I showed earlier. Product quartile, much the same. I've got 1,200 different products, 1,198. 215 of those are key. Excuse me. 3.1, so 3.9% of my total revenue is in 600 products. I've doubled my business. I've doubled my product count for 3.9%. Here's where this tool gets especially powerful. Now I'm going to zoom out real quick here so I can just show, again, this is what the overall granular quad looks like. We can see quad 1 here in green, quad 2, quad 3, quad 4. You can see just how huge quad 4 is right here. But some of the features that we've added to this after talking with a lot of these businesses, after going through these assessments, is we've added some additional analysis tools that I think really help tell a good story. And I'm going to go through those here at the bottom. Right here, I've got customer. Right now, I've got customer. In this case, I've anonymized them for this business, but I've got customer number 39366. It's a $2.7 million customer. Count of 80 means how many unique times or how many unique SKUs in the 80 do they purchase. So it tells me this customer buys 3 SKUs that are in my 80. They're in my high volume products. They don't buy any products that are in my low volume products. Over the last 12 months, we did 54 transactions, and the average dollars of the transactions was $51,212. I want to thank Pete and his team at Nylock for coming up with this. This wasn't my idea. Those guys did a fantastic job, and I'm glad we were able to coordinate it. Now, let's contrast that with customer number 2, customer number 19857. They bought 58 high volume products and 152 low volume products to generate $1.63 million in revenue. They did 1,400 transactions and only averaged $1,172 per transaction. Now, that tells me I don't know anything about this business. I honestly, well, I can kind of guess, but I forgot where we pulled this data set from initially. It tells me that there are 2 very unique things going on within these different data sets. I've got customers that buy very few products. I've got customers that buy a lot of products. So what I would do in this case is I would say, okay, what are the different ways now that we can segment this data? Maybe this customer is a distributor and they take on the complexity for us. Maybe the other one is a ship direct. But the point is that as you go through these analyses, you're always thinking about how can I segment the data differently? And because we've got this great automation tool, now you can segment the data in a different way. You can rerun it and see what that data tells you. Compare them to each other. In this case, again, Midwest, Southeast, we've got different regions. So look at ways that you can always change up that segmentation. The last thing I'll leave you with is we have the same thing for a product standpoint. So this product number one, count of 80, count of 20. How many 80 customers am I selling this to? How many 20 customers? How many transactions did it take for me to sell this? And what's my average dollars per transaction? Again, you can see these numbers varying wildly, and there's another opportunity to look at segmentation. Let me get back to our presentation here. This again is a cheat sheet as you go through the first quad analysis. What are some of the different things that you look at? I always say start with the quartiles. What revenue is your bottom? Look at your customer quartiles. Look at that half mark. Move to the quads. In an upcoming release of this quad and quartile tool, we'll be able to include contribution margin, material margin. I'll keep everybody on this call posted for when those features come out. Again, how does product and transactional complexity increase or decrease throughout the quad? Remember we said earlier, what about conditional key customers? We may want to be a little bit less strict on how we apply rules to those customers. High growth potential, are we treating them differently? And most importantly, going through that first data set that we process, ask yourself, how can I resegment that data to further understand the facts? Consider things like product life cycle too, machine capacity, relationships with the customer, those types of things. Again, sorry, there's a fire truck going on outside, I apologize. Always go back and print this out, these quad thinking points. What are some of the things what are the questions you can ask yourself as you go through each one of the different quads? So I've thrown a lot of examples out at you, but I don't know all the specifics of your business. Again, we've got 169 people in there. It would take me forever to do that. But for this to work, what I encourage people to do is create a structured framework around it that's based in scientific thinking. If you only take one thing from this training, I really hope you take more, but if you take one thing from this training, it's going to be this next slide. I encourage you to develop what I call a cadence and a methodology for your data review. So here's how I would do it, is I would schedule a monthly meeting at my business. I called it the most important meeting of the month. And it was done right after close so that we always had fresh data to work from. Many businesses do it once a quarter. I would say that in today's situation, with the virus, with everything going on and all the uncertainty, doing it more frequently would be better. In addition to how frequently you choose to meet, who comes to that meeting is just as important. I have every major stakeholder, my sales lead, my controller, engineering, plant manager, customer service, really every stakeholder in the organization. And once we've established that cadence, whether it's monthly, quarterly, whatever, it's all about this methodology. Excuse me. And this is the format that I use. Again, I shamelessly stole it from the transportation sector. Jennifer Reeves, if you're on this call, you're a genius. Thank you for helping develop this. But this is the format that I would use. And for the first review, I let that the thinking sheet, the cheat sheet, guide the thinking, and develop action items specifically around what the data is telling you. So we determine what data looks non-homogeneous, such as transaction counts, and look at how to segment them, right? Look at what segments make sense. In this meeting, it's not uncommon for us to look at the data segmented more than a dozen different ways. We would look at segmenting by market channel, make versus buy, material type, customer type. Each business is going to segment their data a little differently and rerun that quad and see what that quad tells them. What this has is when the quad review happens, so 3, 4, 19 in the first line, who the owner is, what their area is, And I'll just go through some of these action items. This action item, in this case, it was a quad 4 item. We want to remove the availability to schedule a low volume part on a high volume line. Consider batching those because of the nature of what we determine from the data. The next time we'll review it is in our April quad review. And so far the learning is that it's going to reduce 6 changeovers per week. Let's use Elvis's on 3.1 in sales. We had customer XYZ. We classified them as a conditional key, and we put a very strict time frame on that. We said if we don't see, if we start to see changes in their buying habits and they become a key customer, great. But in this case, we're going to give them 3 months and we're going to reevaluate after that. And you can see all the different items, the different action items that come out of this. It's those action items that are important. That's a direct result of this granular data review. And I would say most importantly, it captures our learning through this process. So it captures the learning, like Lou's example in sales right here, where we say we want to have a contribution target in our bottom quartile of 40%. So therefore, for this customer, I have to increase by 6%. To capture that and say, listen, so far we've got no pushback from customers. We haven't lost any business. I think that's incredibly important data to capture. And that's what makes this whole process of quad review really work. I'm going to open up a second poll here. And I'd like everybody to be honest. And let me figure out how to do this. This poll asks the question, today, before going through this webinar, select the statement that you feel most encompasses how your business does quad and quartile review. Again, no fault here. It's fine. If you don't use quads and quartiles, that's fine. I would just like to understand that. A lot of businesses use the simple 4-box summary. What I mean by that is you have quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, quad 4. I've got X customers here. Here's my revenue. Here's my contribution margin. Often it doesn't go beyond that 4-box. Number 3 is you use granular data review, but you don't necessarily capture what I showed in the previous slide, the line by line item. And then number 4 is you do granular review and you go through and you have a cadence and methodology developed. I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. All right, and we're going to end the polling here, and I'll share the results. Interesting. Okay, so only 4 businesses don't use quads and quartiles. That is incredibly encouraging. I tell you, I'm especially encouraged that number 3 got such a high score. So that tells me, again, when this quad tool is fully available, fully scaled, again, you can use it, but we just don't have it beefy enough for everybody to run at the same time. You know, hopefully that tells me that this is something that can be really valuable. And again, very encouraged to see there are 14 companies that do this kind of granular analysis. For those companies, I'd really like to talk with you guys and especially for me to learn from you on what kinds of things, how you capture that information, what kind of information you see as valuable. So I did not make this poll anonymous. If you're one of the 14 that answered number 4, I should have said this before, I'm sorry. But if you're one of those that answered in number 4, I'll be reaching out to you and I'd like to schedule maybe a 15-minute call. And again, where can I learn from you? Where can we do best practice sharing? Maybe there's some things in there that we can definitely learn from each other. All right. One of the things that I want to leave you with, we're wrapping up here, is that quads work in all facets of the business. We presented this from the typical customer and product standpoint, but it's truly a lot more powerful than that. Work closely with Jeff Cott over in the electrical product sector and Bruce Belcher in the water sector, where we brought together their purchasing teams and we ran quads on suppliers and commodities. And we're able to do exactly the same kind of granular data analysis that I just showed from the sales forcing side of the business on the purchasing side of the business. And I think it's just as powerful on those businesses. So we're going to continue to do that out through the sectors. Quad training number 3 is going to be focused on other ways to use quads. There's a talent perspective. There are a couple different ways that we can do it from there. But yeah, that's what's going to be the next side of this. And I just want to leave you with a few just bits of wisdom. Kelly Deere, who's been doing this for many, many years, one of his famous phrases was, "Getting simple is hard work," and that's absolutely the case. You know, what I presented to you here is tough. It's getting everybody together. It's getting the team together. It's really going through the data. It's determining how to resegment the data. It's work, and it involves a lot of people. But for the businesses that do this, I guarantee you will absolutely see results of this. And patience and consistency is absolutely crucial when going through this process. So thank you, everybody, especially with what's going on. Please stay healthy. This is really unprecedented. I'm glad you were able to join me, and glad we were able to go through this. I'm going to open it up. Beth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you a sec and go through if we have any questions here.
Yeah, Rob, there were a couple of questions. The first one is from Katrina, and she's asked, does the quad automation still support up to 50,000 line items?
Great question, Katrina. Colson Medical Group, our most recent sector, our most recent acquisition, we just processed a data set from them, 1,820,000 line items. So it will support that. It takes a long time. It took a couple minutes to process that data set. You know, I should have mentioned this earlier. For everyone that's still on the line, it looks like not many people, almost nobody's dropped off. If you are a geek like me and you know how to use an executable, if you want to use this right away, I do have it in executable format. You can see my contact information right there. I'll make the executable expire though, so that we don't have a million versions that are going out there. But if it's something that you'd like to start using right away, we can share that as a temporary thing until, again, we're able to scale this quad automation. So yeah, thank you, Katrina. Great question.
One more question, Rob. What do the quad ratios generally look like after optimizing?
Oh, great question. What I typically see is not so much in the quads, but in the quartiles. I'll typically see, well, actually, let me answer it like this. One of the things that we typically see is the total number, the total count of the SKUs and the customers in the quartiles downstream start to go down. So instead of having 100 customers, now we have 75 customers, but those 75 customers are much more profitable. Instead of having 200 products, now we have 175 products. But again, those products are much more profitable. So great question. I hope I answered that okay.
One more that just came in. Any chance that the quad tool will be enhanced to support both revenue and margin data within the same quad?
Yes, the next, so if you look on my scale here, or on the slide here, under upcoming automation features, number 2, we're actually testing this right now. I'm going through a test round today, so I hope to have it available soon. I do not have an exact time frame on it yet, but what I've done is I've incorporated 2 different margins into it, so you'll be able to see what the trends look like by quad as you rerun these. So my thought behind that is some businesses use material margin and contribution margin. Some businesses use variable margin. Some business, you know, it all depends on what you want to see. But when that's available, what we're going to do is we're going to have a total of 6 columns on the input data set. The column 5 and 6 will be for like, what's my material cost? You know, what's my overhead cost? Those kinds of things. So yes, I hope to have that available very, very soon. Again, we're testing that out right now. So thank you. Great question.
And that's all I see, Rob.
All right. My contact information is up here, everybody. If you'd like to reach out, if you have any questions that, you know, if something comes up afterward, feel free to reach out. If it's something where you'd like that executable, again, feel free to reach out. Everyone that's on this list, we will get an invite to the second round. Again, if you found this valuable, I encourage you, please please come to the second round. And yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And Beth, thank you. Really appreciate your help.
You're welcome. Nice job, Rob.
All right, stay safe, everybody.